Marijuana is not legal. Okay, well, some is. Medical marijuana. And growing it is, if you're licensed. Oh, and also now, if you grow it yourself with a prescription. Or that's how it will be. And then there are the dispensaries, and the Liberal campaign promised to legalize, and, well, let's try to shed some light on the gray areas of our evolving pot policy in Canada, shall we? In Welland, Ontario, via Skype, there's Jenna Valeriani. She's a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Toronto. And here in studio, Paul Lewin, lawyer and Ontario director for NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Canada. Great to have you both on the program tonight. As we can tell, this is a complicated story. So, Jenna, perhaps I can prevail upon you to give us just a brief backgrounder on what the court decided so we can set the table for the discussion to come.
So a federal court judge just recently struck down the federal regulations restricting the rights of medical marijuana patients to grow their own cannabis. And this was based on Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedom. And the judge actually gave the Liberals about 6 months to come up with new rules. And in that decision, he noted that there are still thousands of medical cannabis users who are not covered by the original injunction, who will need to wait for the government to amend the regulations.
So until the Liberals get their act together, what does that mean for the next 6 months?
Well, it means that things are kind of in the air right now. People who are covered under the injunction can continue to grow, whereas those who are now under the MMPR are going to have to wait a little bit longer. Okay,
Paul, that was what the law was until 2014. The Harper government, I gather, changed it. Why did they do that?
Well, their professed reasons were that home grows were not safe, that they were there was diversion going on. People were diverting it to the black market, growing for themselves. Their allegation, and as well as air quality issues in the home, these were found to be not valid by the judge. The government had an opportunity to call all their best evidence. They heard all their best evidence, and the court found that really you can grow safely in your home.
If given the choice, do you think most people would prefer to grow their own?
I think it's probably a mixed bag. I think some would like the idea of being able to get somewhere else, but I think many people, particularly people who are the most vulnerable, those who suffer a lot of pain, who are more likely to be on public assistance and have to consume a lot of cannabis over the course of the day, can't afford to buy from LPs. And so they very much want to grow their own.
Can't afford to buy from?
Oh, the LPs or the licensed producers, the new companies.
Gotcha. Is it difficult to grow your own?
It requires some skill. It's definitely not for everybody, but there are a lot of people out there who have a lot of skill in this area. And it seems kind of a shame that people who have, and this skill also involves acquiring and creating an ideal strain for their conditions. So there's a lot of people out there who have a lot of skill and knowledge in this area.
All right, let's bring a graphic up right now and just give people a sense of how widespread this is. Best guesses say that there are about 40,000 medical marijuana users in Canada right now. Expected 450,000 medical marijuana users by the year 2024. There are currently, however, 29 licensed producers in Canada, 16 of which are in Ontario. Okay, that's what the numbers suggest. Jenna, I wonder if you could tell us how many unlicensed dispensaries would you say there are across the country?
Well, that's a very difficult number to get. And the reason why is a lot of them are unregulated. Well, all of them are unregulated, actually. So it's really hard to get a number. Some of them exist online only. Some of them just exist. And they pop up by, there's about 10 to 15 each week in Toronto alone. So estimates are around 300 to 350 across Canada.
Now, if they are not licensed, does that mean that they are illegal?
If we want to speak about them in black and white terms, yes, they are illegal, but I think it's more accurate to discuss them as existing in a gray area or a gray zone because they've traditionally been shown to be filling a lot of gaps in medical cannabis access in Canada.
Okay, in a gray zone. So if are the police trying, Paul, to close these places down if they're not technically legal but not technically illegal?
Well, it depends on where you're talking. So in Vancouver and Toronto, in Toronto, at least, if you follow certain rules, rough, unspoken, unarticulated rules, but they are, if you really are truly only selling to medical people, you have no weapons on site, you don't sell to minors, you have no organized crime ties, and you respect your neighbors, then the police are leaving you alone. So that's how it is in Toronto.
The police leave you alone in Toronto. Can anybody buy from them?
Well, you've got to be truly medical. So different clubs have different screening processes, but there's got to be a legit effort to ensure they're using marijuana for medical purposes.
Does that mean you've got to show up with a prescription of some kind?
Of some kind, yes.
Okay, well, that's obviously you can drive a truck through that loophole there. Of some kind means what?
Well, one thing is you could have the document that the LPs use, the licensed producers use, signed by a doctor. You could have a letter signed by a doctor, perhaps not the form that's used by the licensed producers, but a letter in which he sets out, listen, this person needs medical marijuana. I think it would be legitimate to use an authorization to possess, which was under the old system. So these are people who are consuming legally under the old system. So these are all people who legitimately can access medical marijuana.
Okay, last November, City News did a little investigation on this, and they sent somebody into a Toronto dispensary to try to purchase. And here's a clip from their report. Let's watch.
City News asks what we need to get our hands on some of the medical marijuana products displayed behind the glass.
You need to have a prescription, either for medical marijuana or a prescription for something else that medical marijuana can treat. You bring that in, you show that to us, you get a membership card.
City News is told either you need a doctor's note or just to bring in an empty prescription bottle. But because computers are down right now, you can just get what you want without showing anything.
Jenna, is that the way it's supposed to work?
No, I think that that City News segment was something that was pretty indicative of a few different things. I think that the proliferation of dispensaries is really telling us that patients want on-site access. They want to be able to talk to people. They want to be able to interact with people when they go and pick up their medication. And it would be wrong to assume that everybody who begins using cannabis as a medicine actually has that experience. So imagine if you had no experience and you just receive a package on your front doorstep with no information on administration, on dosing. So I think that patients are seeking out dispensaries because they want to be able to see their cannabis. They want to talk to people. They need that one-on-one contact. And on the other hand, I think the proliferation of dispensaries is also pointing to the fact that Canadians are ready for recreational access. So I think that slippage that we're seeing in intake procedures and, this variation of different dispensaries and kind of their practices, is telling us something that, Canadians are ready for, legalization that includes government regulated retail shops. And then on the other hand, like any other industry, there's the good and there's the bad.
Paul, it didn't look like, if you can walk in there with an empty bottle of pills, the protocols don't seem like they're too strict in this case, do they?
They don't, but what this really highlights the flaw in the government's approach to dispensaries. They should be regulating them. Don't push them underground. And this is really, I think, what drove Vancouver to take a more enlightened approach and allow them to come out of the shadows and say, we're going to regulate them. But if you push them into the back alleys, if you don't allow them to interact with the authorities, then you're going to have people who aren't really following the rules.
What impact do you think these, shall we call them more lax dispensaries, are having on genuine medical dispensaries?
Well, I guess you could say it does undermine the more legitimate ones a bit. I guess that would be a fair thing to say.
Okay, and what percentage of the people visiting all of these dispensaries do you think are genuine medical marijuana, people who genuinely need medical marijuana for their pain?
Oh, I think a very high percentage. And I think a very high percentage of dispensaries are operating in a responsible manner and trying their best to enforce the rules.
How do you know that?
Well, I'm very involved in the community, so I guess it's mostly hearsay information, but it's information I've received by being a part of the industry for a while.
Jenna, what's your best guess on what percentage of the people who attend these dispensaries actually need them for medical purposes?
I think it's also, quite high. What I'm thinking is that there's a lot of medical conditions that patients would typically have trouble gaining access to through their doctors. For example, a variety of mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. Anecdotally, a lot of patients have found a lot of success using cannabis for these conditions, but it's really difficult to get a doctor to prescribe cannabis for those conditions. And also, it really plays on this idea of what's considered medical, what's therapeutic, and what's recreational. So essentially, I think that it's a mix. But I think a lot of people who are accessing dispensaries do have some kind of medical or therapeutic need.
And Jenna, follow up with this, because when we showed those numbers earlier, it looks like the number of medical marijuana users over the next, not even 10 years, is expected to grow, from 40 to 450,000. Why are we anticipating such a big explosion in those numbers?
Well, I think one of the things that the MMPR is doing is kind of standardizing and legitimizing cannabis as a medicine to a more kind of popular audience. So under the old program, it was estimated that about less than 7% of doctors would prescribe cannabis, whereas now we're seeing those numbers increase and doctors are receiving more education on it. There's more studies being done. So I think that doctors are becoming more comfortable. So I think that is in large part partly, a reason for those expected numbers is that doctors are going to start feeling more comfortable with it. But also, not thinking about cannabis as a last resort. So I think traditionally cannabis has kind of been the last thing that people turn to. But as doctors get more comfortable prescribing cannabis, we're going to see those numbers grow as we see a lot more research, which is happening right now. And as we see doctors get a lot more comfortable with that.
Paul, we have seen over the past week in particular, there are a lot of actors who want to get into this field. Shoppers Drug Mart wants to start, and it's called itself the safest option for medical marijuana distribution. You've looked at this. Do you think they are?
I don't know if I'd say that they're the safest option. I'm not opposed to them getting into the game, but I am opposed to this attitude, and it's also expanding into the legalization discussion, which we say, well, who should be able to dispense this? And the government saying, well, let's sell this out of liquor stores. That's the most responsible way. Everyone's the most responsible approach. But, there's a lot of knowledge out there, and Jenna talked about a little bit of it, about dosing, about strains, about means of administration. There's better ways to consume it rather than smoking. You can vaporize, much less damage. You can eat it. And there's all unique issues to all of this. So what I'm saying is, let's not lose all this knowledge that's out there. There's people who have been running these shops for years. Let them keep doing it and use their knowledge. And why put them out of a job, too, so shoppers can expand their empire.
Do you have a view, though, on what the best way to distribute this is? If you look at a mix of LCBO, shoppers, Rexall's probably wants into this as well. There's an outfit in London that wants in. You've got all these independent actors now. What's the best regimen?
So we're talking about two different types of dispensing. There's medical, and certainly, shoppers and the other pharmacies can sell it, but don't shut down the dispensaries. In terms of recreational, I hate the idea of selling it in liquor stores. It's contrary to public health. Why do we want to put cannabis up on the shelf next to whiskey? So that we're sending a message that, well, you want to get both of these things. It's a bad message. I know it's a great cash cow, or it would be for the government. Don't shut out the cannabis community. Let them use their knowledge. Let them keep their work. And unfortunately, the government will just have to get by on the tax money.
Jenna, what's your view on whether the LCBO ought to have the monopoly on selling pot in the province as well?
I don't think that the LCBO is an appropriate venue to have cannabis alongside the shelves of alcohol. I think what would be, kind of a better model is to let people, open government-regulated retail shops. And it's not to say that, cannabis can't be available at other venues as well, but I don't think alongside alcohol is the best approach to take.
We all remember, Paul, Justin Trudeau making the very high-profile commitment during the election campaign to legalize even recreational marijuana use. Realistically, how long should it take for him to fulfill that commitment?
Well, I would say we're probably looking at 2 years. For jurisdictional reasons, he's going to have to consult with all the provinces. He can't take it off the books and make it not a crime, but not have any regulatory regime in place in the province. Some of the provinces, like Saskatchewan's, are very conservative, has a conservative government. They've said things to suggest they're not going to cooperate. So this is going to be, you've got to get all the provinces and territories on board, and they've also said they're going to consult widely, and they should consult widely. I would say this, though, in the meantime, people shouldn't be going to jail, and people are still being prosecuted for cannabis offenses as we speak. And, nobody should be the last person shot in World War II.
Can you imagine a situation where the federal government just says, okay, we're legalizing, and each of you provinces, you figure out how you want to regulate this thing? Does that make any sense?
Well, it doesn't, because when you take it off the books out of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, then essentially anything would be legal if there's no provincial regulatory regime to replace it.
Jenna, 2 years really to make that promise come true?
I think that is probably about accurate. The first thing that the Liberals should be doing is decriminalizing cannabis right now. It seems so absurd that they're enforcing a law that they've stated, prohibition doesn't work, that this model has failed, and yet they're still continuing to criminalize people for cannabis-related charges.
Well, I guess it's not the federal government that does that, right? I mean, presumably it's the provincial authorities that still arrest people, or municipal police forces, that kind of thing?
Sure, but that still comes, drug policy still comes top down, so they're just following the law.
Gotcha. Paul, will this ruling have an impact on what the industry will look like if and when it's finally legalized?
Oh, it will. And I think this is a huge ruling for the future of cannabis in Canada. Of course, so you ask about a legalized recreational regime. It has the potential to open the door to home growing for recreational reasons. The court's already said, you know what, there's no safety issues here. This is all overblown. I can grow 10 tomato plants in my basement, but if there are 10 cannabis plants, everyone's property values drop and my house is about to blow up. That was all debunked.
Well, because I guess it happened once, right? Happened once in a big high-profile way, and therefore it's become a bit of a stain for everybody else?
Well, yeah, and I'm not sure when you're talking about when you say it happened.
Well, there was some grow-up, I think, up in Barrie several years ago that had a big explosion, and after that, it sort of, everybody got spooked about it, right?
You know, it might have been turning dried marijuana into oil. That there are safety issues with that, but not just straight-up growing.
Okay.
So,
Jenna, let me get your view on this aspect of the legalization debate. You know, governments clearly love the idea of selling marijuana in circumstances that they can control because the revenue potential for them is enormous. And particularly in Ontario, when you're looking at the deficit and debt issues we're dealing with right here, they're looking to marijuana as a solution. Do you think the financial implications of legalization are huge enough that they could be that big a boon for the province's bottom line?
I do think for sure that there's a lot of economic opportunity to be had here, but I don't think that we should just reach to the LCBO model because there's an existing infrastructure there because it's the easiest thing to do. I think that, there would be a really large, loss to the economy if we didn't allow kind of government regulated retail shops to open up. I think that there is a lot of potential there, but also we shouldn't let potential revenue kind of blindside us, particularly politically. I think that what should really be the focus is public health and what public health outcomes will look like.
Paul, you got a guess about what it could deliver to the Treasury if it were legalized and sold in independently owned and operated stores?
I don't have a guess, but I would say this. I don't think we should be looking at this as what a fantastic cash bonanza it's going to be.
Well, politicians are, though, of course, for the reasons I just suggested.
They will. I'll note this, and two different approaches to this. In Colorado, there's been a lot of taxes, and the black market has stayed alive in Colorado because it's very expensive to buy it in the store. So it's cheaper to buy it on the street. If you want to snuff out the black market, don't try and extract every penny. You look at an opposite approach in Uruguay when they legalized. They initially set it at $1 a gram. Prices were cheaper there. But their approach was, we're going to shut down the black market. We're going to make sure everything's done in a safe, responsible manner. Without the black market, I think this is going to be a much safer, smoother transition for everybody if we don't imagine we're going to make a lot of money off this.
Jenna, what's your view on how to handle the black market angle on this story?
Well, I think Paul kind of hit it on the head. If we don't find ways to incorporate, for example, the gray market and where dispensaries are existing, we're always going to have this kind of gray market running parallel to legalization. So I think it's really important that we address what's going on instead of just reaching to, very easy solutions.
So what does the world look like, Paul? Let's assume you're right. 2 years down the road when we've got open legalization in the country. What do you see?
Well, I see that there's going to be much less alcohol. It's going to be a smaller problem in society. The organized crime is going to have a much smaller revenue sources, so they're going to be poorer for it. People will be able to access cannabis. People who were buying it in back alleys, which makes things much less safe, are going to be able to buy it in a store, which is much safer for everyone. There will be some tax revenue, so the government will be a little more well off. Society will generally be safer because people, if you have perhaps a couple have a small grow and maybe perhaps the woman there's domestic violence issues. She's afraid to call the police because they've got their handful of plants. Now she can call the police. It's going to be a safer society. It's going to be a somewhat more well-off society. And hopefully it's going to be sold. I can have a handful of plants in my basement. Hopefully, I can go buy it at a local store from someone who's been in this industry for years, who can tell me about the best strain on offer, has been in this industry for a while.
Jenna, how about you? 2 years down the road, if and when this is finally legalized, what do you see happening?
I think a lot of what Paul said is also true. I mean, if we look to Colorado, youth rates are down, and generally, the sky hasn't fallen there. So I think we can also expect a booming tourism industry, which is kind of what's happening in Colorado as well. We'll expect a lot of job creation, and we're going to see a really, really big industry, and we're going to see it grow and change shape as we move forward.
And Jenna, just for those people who are concerned that if you open this up so much, we're going to start seeing a lot more students showing up for school stoned, or a lot more smoking joints around school grounds, what's the argument there?
Well, I think that the research shows that currently in Ontario students actually find cannabis easier to access, and that's easier than tobacco and easier than alcohol. So what that signifies to me is that prohibition isn't working at keeping cannabis out of the hands of young people. So if we have proper regulation around cannabis, it'll be harder for them to access, because we have to remember that the black market does not ID. Whereas if we had regulation, we could set a minimum age, we could talk about harm reduction, and all the other things that come around with a more holistic public health approach.
Understood. Jenna Valeriani from the University of Toronto. We've got you on Skype from Welland. Thank you for joining us from the Niagara Peninsula. And Paul Lewin, the lawyer with the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Canada, Normal Canada. We thank you both for being on TVO with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.